The winding road into Hollow Creek was a serpent of cracked asphalt, coiling through the dense, brooding Kentucky woods as if trying to hide the town from the world. For Sarah, each curve was a turn back in time, the heavy scent of damp earth and pine pulling her deeper into a past she had fought for over a decade to escape. The silence was the first thing that struck her, a physical weight pressing against the rental car's windows. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a watchful one, thick with secrets the very trees seemed to hold in their gnarled roots. The town appeared suddenly, a clutch of weathered buildings huddled in the valley as if for protection, or perhaps from shame. She drove slowly down the main street, the tires crunching over gravel that seemed too loud in the oppressive hush. A man on the porch of the general store paused in his whittling, his knife stilling as he watched her pass. His eyes did not meet hers. They fixed on a point somewhere beyond her, through her, as if she were a ghost he refused to acknowledge. Further on, a woman sweeping her front steps turned her back deliberately, the brisk swish of the broom a clear dismissal. It was the same hollowed-out gaze she remembered from childhood, a community-wide aversion that made every resident an island, marooned in their own private solitude. The old house at the end of Magnolia Lane was exactly as she had left it, yet profoundly different. The white paint was a little more peeled, the wraparound porch sagged a little more deeply on its foundations, and the hydrangeas her grandmother had loved so much grew wild and tangled, their blue heads bowed as if in mourning. She parked and sat for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel, gathering the courage to step back into the constrained air of her youth. The screen door creaked open before she reached the steps, and her father, Elijah, emerged. He stood framed in the doorway, a tall, gaunt man whose shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the entire holler. His face, once strong and defined, was now a landscape of deep lines and weary resignation. He did not smile, nor did he open his arms. He simply looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable pools, and gave a single, slow nod. The distance between them stretched, vast and cold, filled with all the years and all the words never spoken. Inside, the house smelled of dust, old wood, and the cloying sweetness of funeral lilies. The familiar patterns of the worn floral wallpaper triggered a flood of memories, not of joy and laughter, but of hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, of rules that felt more like shackles, of a love that was always conditional, always measured. She remembered sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, listening to the low, tense murmur of adult voices from the kitchen, feeling a chill of something wrong she could never quite name. Her childhood here had been a beautiful, gilded cage, and she had spent her adulthood running from the memory of its bars. Elijah moved to the mantelpiece, his fingers brushing the edge of a framed photograph of his mother. His unease was a palpable force in the room, a vibration in the still air. He was a man guarding a fortress, and Sarah's return was a threat to its crumbling walls. In that heavy silence, surrounded by the ghosts of her constrained past, she felt the first, faint stirrings of a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. The questions she had buried for years began to uncoil in the dark soil of her mind. This was more than a funeral. It was an homecoming to a mystery, and the first clue was the profound, unnatural silence that blanketed everything, a silence she was now determined to break. The rain began as a soft mist, blurring the edges of the old cemetery on the hill, making the gray tombstones look like smudges of charcoal on a wet canvas. It was a fitting shroud for a Hollow Creek funeral, where even the weather seemed to conspire in the collective act of hiding. The townsfolk stood in a loose, black-clad circle around the fresh wound in the earth, their umbrellas forming a canopy of synthetic gloom. Sarah stood beside her father, feeling the rigid tension in his arm where it brushed against hers. He stared straight ahead at the polished casket, his jaw a hard line, his presence a fortress wall against the sorrow, or perhaps against the truth it might unleash. It was during the preacher's droning eulogy, a generic tapestry of virtues that could have described any woman, that Sarah first caught the whispers. They slithered through the damp air from a cluster of older relatives standing just behind her, their voices low and sibilant beneath the patter of rain on nylon. Same as the old man, rest his soul. The sins don't wash out, no matter how hard you scrub. one man muttered, his words like gravel. A woman's voice, thin and reedy, replied, the blood tells, always has, got to keep it pure, no matter the cost. The words, sins pure blood, landed not in her ears, but deep in her gut, a cold, heavy stone of dread. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The speakers, a stooped man with a grizzled beard and a pinched-faced woman, fell instantly silent, their eyes dropping to the mud. They hadn't been sharing a fond memory. They had been exchanging a warning, a piece of a dark, familiar liturgy. After the final prayer, as the crowd began to disperse back towards the church hall for the obligatory casseroles and quiet condolences, Sarah found her mother standing alone under a skeletal oak tree. Her face was pale and drawn, a lace handkerchief clutched in her trembling hands. Who were they talking about? Sarah asked softly, stepping closer. What did they mean about pure blood? Her mother's eyes, the same shade of hazel as her own, darted away, focusing on a distant point in the woods. She gave a tight, dismissive shake of her head, the gesture too quick, too practiced. Just old folks talk, Sarah. Superstition. They're set in their ways, that's all. Don't you pay them any mind, she patted Sarah's arm, a brittle attempt at reassurance, before turning and walking briskly toward the church hall, her retreat as telling as any confession. That evasion, that swift flight from a simple question, was the final thread that snapped. The unease of her homecoming, the town's suffocating silence, the haunted look in her father's eyes. It all coalesced into a single, driving certainty. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong in Hollow Creek, and it was rooted in the very soil, in the blood that ran in her own veins. The mystery was no longer a ghost from her past. It was a living, breathing sickness, and she was now infected with the need to understand it. Back at her rented room above the shuttered post office, she stared out the window at the rain-slicked Main Street. The decision settled within her, cold and clear. She would not be leaving with the rest of the out-of-town relatives. She texted her boss in Lexington, requesting an extended personal leave, the lies about estate paperwork forming easily on her screen. Her bags, still half unpacked, became a promise. She was staying. Her investigation began the next day, a quiet, discreet campaign waged with coffee and feigned nostalgia. She visited old Mrs. Peabody, who lived in a clapboard house smelling of camphor and dried herbs. Sarah asked about her grandmother's famous rose garden, then gently steered the conversation toward family histories, the old names on the deeds. The old woman's eyes clouded over, her stories becoming vague and meandering whenever a surname from Sarah's own line was mentioned. At the general store, she bought a soda and chatted with the elderly clerk, Mr. Henderson, about how little the town had changed. When she mentioned her grandfather's name, the man's friendly demeanor stiffened. He suddenly found an urgent need to reorganize a shelf of canned beans, his answers becoming curt, dismissive. The past is best left buried, child, he finally said, not meeting her eyes. Some roots, they ain't meant to be dug up. Each conversation was a door gently closed in her face. Each evasive glance another piece of the puzzle. The elders of Hollow Creek were the keepers of the town's soul, and they were guarding it with a silence as deep and impenetrable as the surrounding woods. But with every refusal, every flicker of fear in an old person's eyes, Sarah's suspicion hardened into resolve. The echoes of the past were here, whispering on the wind, and she would follow them, no matter how dark the path became. The key to every family's soul is not found in its stories, but in its numbers, the stark, unforgiving arithmetic of birth and death that charts a lineage through time. For Sarah, that key was hidden in the perpetual twilight of her grandmother's attic, a space that smelled of decaying paper, cedar, and the profound silence of things long forgotten. It was on her third day of extended stay, under the pretext of gathering keepsakes, that she found it. Pushed deep into a cobwebbed crevice behind a steamer trunk filled with moth-eaten quilts was a wooden box, its lock rusted shut. A sharp tug with a rusted fire poker splintered the old wood around the clasp, and the lid gave way with a groan of protest. Inside, nestled in a bed of yellowed tissue, lay a ledger. It was massive, bound and scuffed, dark leather the color of dried blood, its cover embossed with a family crest that time had rendered nearly illegible. The spine cracked ominously as she opened it, releasing a cloud of ancient dust that danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the grimy dormer window. The pages were thick, high-quality paper, but they were brittle at the edges, each one filled with elegant, looping script in faded black ink. It was a genealogical record, a meticulous accounting of the family of Hollow Creek. She sat on the dusty floorboards, the heavy book laid across her lap, and began to read. The entries were stark and formal, recording the births, marriages, and deaths stretching back over a century. At first, it was a simple, if somber, history, but as her eyes traveled down the pages, moving from the late 1800s into the more recent decades, patterns began to emerge, subtle at first, then undeniable. The same surnames recurred with a frequency that defied the odds of a small town, weaving through the family tree like a persistent, inescapable vine. Millers married Millers. Carters married Carters. The branches of the family tree were not spreading outward. They were curling back in on themselves, twisting into a tight, suffocating knot. Her finger traced a line of entries from the 1940s, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the margins, were small, cryptic symbols drawn in a different, sharper hand. A tiny, closed circle, a series of interlocking loops, a crosshatch that looked like a barred window. They appeared beside certain names, a silent, coded commentary on the lives recorded. She saw the names of her own great-grandparents, a Miller and a Carter, and beside them the closed circle. Then, a generation later, her grandfather, Elijah Miller Sr., had married Beatrice Carter. First cousins. The closed circle appeared beside their names as well. A cold dread, colder than the attic's chill, seeped into her bones. She cross-referenced the dates, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her father, Elijah Jr., was born from that union. The whispers at the funeral, the talk of pure blood, suddenly took on a horrifying, concrete shape. This was not mere superstition or isolated scandal. The ledger was a map of deliberate generational inbreeding. The repeated names were not a coincidence. They were a design. The cryptic symbols were a key to a secret the family had kept locked away in this very book, a testament to a practice they knew was wrong, but had perpetuated for generations. The silence of Hollow Creek was not just a cultural quirk. It was the sound of a community holding its breath, guarding a terrible, shared truth that was now laid bare in the brittle pages on her lap. The cold dread that had seeped into Sarah's bones in the attic now crystallized into a sharp, piercing horror as she turned the page. The elegant script continued its relentless march through the decades, each entry a brick in a wall of silence she was now dismantling. Her own name, Sarah Miller, was there, a recent entry in the birth records. Her eyes, gritty with dust and exhaustion, scanned upward to find the details of her parents' marriage. She found Elijah Miller Jr. and Lillian Hayes, the date a simple line of ink that belied the complexity of the union. But it was the entry directly above Lillian's name, in the birth records from 2 decades prior, that made the world tilt on its axis. Lillian Hayes, daughter of Elijah Miller Jr. and Cora Hayes. The words did not make sense at first. They were just shapes on a page, an administrative error, a trick of the dim light. She read them again, her mind refusing to assemble the pieces. Lillian Hayes, daughter of Elijah Miller Jr., her mother. Her father's daughter. The dates aligned with impossible, cruel precision. Lillian had been born when Elijah was just 17, the birth recorded with the same stark formality as all the others. Cora Hayes, a name Sarah had never heard, was listed as the mother, her own entry marked with one of the cryptic, barred window symbols. Then her eyes dropped back to the marriage entry. Elijah Miller Jr. had married Lillian Hayes. He had married his own daughter. The ledger slipped from her numb fingers, its heavy weight thudding dully on the floorboards, raising a final cloud of ancestral dust. A violent tremor ran through her hands. She was not just the product of cousins. She was the offspring of a father and his child. Elijah was not just her father. He was her grandfather. The twisted branches of the family tree were not just intertwined. They were a noose, and it was tightening around her own throat. The pure blood they had sought to preserve was a poisoned well, and she had been drinking from it her entire life. Her gaze fell upon her own birth entry again. Sarah Miller, daughter of Elijah Miller Jr. and Lillian Miller née, hazed the reality of her own bloodline unfolded in her mind with devastating clarity. She was her father's daughter, and she was his granddaughter. The genetic echo was not a faint whisper from generations past. It was a scream from the previous one. The shame that had permeated her childhood, the averted eyes, the hushed tones. It had not been about some vague ancestral sin. It had been about this. Her very existence was the secret. Stumbling to her feet, she leaned against the rough-hewn wall, the house seeming to pulse around her with a malevolent awareness. She looked out the grimy attic window, down at the town of Hollow Creek nestled in its valley. The quiet streets, the closed doors, the people who had watched her grow up. They all knew. The shopkeeper, the old woman at the funeral, her own relatives. Their silence was not ignorance. It was a conspiracy, a community-wide pact to look away, to pretend the monstrous was normal, to protect their twisted legacy from the judgment of the outside world and from the horror of their own reflections. They had all been complicit in building this gilded cage of lies, and she had been born inside it, never knowing the true nature of the bars. The ledger had not just revealed a family secret. It had held up a mirror to the soul of the entire town, and the reflection was more grotesque than she could have ever imagined. The truth was a sickness in her blood, a fever that burned away all other thoughts as Sarah descended from the attic's sepulchral silence. The ledger's revelations pulsed behind her eyes, a grotesque film reel she could not pause or escape. The house itself felt different, its familiar angles now distorted, every creak of a floorboard a whisper of the incestuous secret it had sheltered for decades. She found her mother in the kitchen, mechanically wiping the already clean counter, her movements a fragile pantomime of normalcy. The sight of her, this woman who had brushed her hair, packed her lunches, soothed childhood nightmares, now felt like a profound and terrifying deception. Sarah placed the heavy ledger on the kitchen table with a definitive thud that made her mother flinch. The sound echoed in the quiet room, a gunshot signaling the end of the peace they had all pretended to share. Lillian's hands stilled, the damp cloth crumpled in her grip. She did not turn around, but her shoulders tensed, rising defensively toward her ears as if bracing for a physical blow. "It's all in here, isn't it?" Sarah's voice was quiet, stripped of all emotion, a flat line of sound in the charged air. "Everything. The names. The dates. What he did. What you are to him. What I am to both of you." Lillian turned slowly, her face a mask of pale dread. Her eyes, so like Sarah's, were wide with a trapped animal fear. She looked from her daughter's stony face to the opened ledger, to the damning entry that spelled out her own origin and her daughter's cursed lineage. The denial was there, poised on her lips, a last, desperate attempt to preserve the cage. But the sight of the evidence, the physical weight of their history, shattered her resolve. A broken, guttural sob tore from her throat, and her knees buckled. She collapsed into a chair at the table, her body folding in on itself as decades of enforced silence ruptured. The tears came then, not gentle weeping, but a torrent of raw, shame-filled anguish that shook her entire frame. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly, as if trying to hold the pieces of her life together. "He was just a boy," she choked out, her voice thick with tears. 17. And I was a mistake he tried to make right. Cora, my mother. She was from a neighboring family, but she left. She couldn't bear the shame, so she left me with him. It was what was expected. To keep the land. To keep the name. To keep the blood pure. She spat the last word as if it were poison. She looked up at Sarah, her expression one of utter devastation. "He's my father, Sarah. Elijah is my father. And when I was of age, it was just what was done. There was no one else. There is never anyone else. The family, the whole town, they just looked away. They called it tradition. They called it protecting what's ours. But it's a sin. It's always been a sin, and we've all been drowning in it. The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sarah was his daughter, and she was his granddaughter. The words were no longer abstract horrors on a page. They were the foundation of her very being, spoken in the broken voice of the woman who had given her life. The twisted legacy was not some ancient curse. It was a living, breathing practice of shame, enforced by a family and a town that valued their twisted notion of purity more than the souls it destroyed. The silence had not been to protect her. It had been to protect the secret, to maintain the gilded facade of a family rotting from the inside out. In her mother's breakdown, Sarah saw the true cost of their hidden world. A lifetime of carrying a burden so heavy it had finally crushed her. The old Miller house seemed to shrink into the landscape as Sarah approached. Its timbers bowed under the weight of more than just decades of rain. Elijah lived alone now, a solitary king in a decaying kingdom of his own making. The porch steps groaned a protest under her feet, a weary echo of the confrontation to come. She didn't knock. The door was unlocked, as doors had always been in Hollow Creek, where the real threats were not outsiders but the secrets festering within. He was in his worn armchair by the cold fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the ashes as if reading his future in the gray dust. He didn't look up as she entered, but his shoulders stiffened, the only acknowledgement of her presence. She stood before him, the silence stretching taut between them. The ledger's truths were a living entity in the room, sucking the air from the space. Finally, she spoke his name, a single word that cracked the fragile stillness. Elijah! His eyes, the same dark pools she had inherited, lifted to meet hers. There was no surprise in them, no anger, only a deep, unsettling calm. He had been waiting for this. He took a slow sip from his glass, the ice clinking like a tiny bell tolling the end of something. "I know," she said, her voice low and steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. "I read the ledger. I know about Lillian. I know what you are to her, what you are to me." For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze holding hers with an unnerving intensity. Then, he set his glass down on the small table beside him with a precise, deliberate motion. "It had to be done," he said, his voice a dry rasp, devoid of remorse. It was not an apology, but a statement of fact, a creed. "This land, this name, this blood, it's all we have. It's all that's ever been. The world out there." He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the hills that walled them in. "It wants to dilute us, to scatter us to the wind. We had to hold fast. We had to keep the line pure." He spoke of it as a farmer might speak of preserving a rare breed of livestock, with a cold, pragmatic detachment that chilled her to her marrow. He explained the isolation, the fear of outsiders, the belief that their blood was a unique and precious resource that would be tainted by foreign strains. He detailed the careful, generations-long planning, the marriages arranged not for love, but for genetic consolidation, a fortress built not of stone, but of shared DNA. He was not a monster in his own eyes. He was a guardian, a preserver of a sacred, if twisted, tradition. His lack of shame was more horrifying than any admission of guilt could have been. He saw the cycle of abuse not as a sin, but as a necessity, a bitter medicine required for the survival of his world. He spoke of Lillian, his daughter and his wife, not with lust or love, but with a sense of grim duty. He spoke of Sarah, his daughter and granddaughter, as the next link in the chain, a living testament to his success. In his mind, the physical and emotional deformities that surely lurked in their bloodline were not tragedies, but the honorable scars of a battle fought to maintain their insular purity. He was a man so deeply entrenched in his own denial that the truth had become his enemy, and his own family were soldiers in a war they never chose to fight. The confession was not a plea for understanding. It was a declaration of a faith so absolute it had blinded him to its own monstrous nature. The silence of Hollow Creek was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence, a living, breathing entity woven from countless individual acts of complicity. In the days following Elijah's chilling confession, Sarah walked the town's familiar streets and saw it everywhere. It was in the way two women chatting on a porch would fall instantly quiet as she passed, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and reproach. It was in the quick, furtive glances exchanged between the old men playing checkers outside the barbershop, a silent telegraph of shared knowledge. The town was not ignorant. It was a chorus of mutes, all singing the same terrible song without ever making a sound. The secret of the inbreeding was not a handful of isolated family shames. It was the very mortar that held the community's crumbling walls together, a collective burden of shame that bound them in a web of unspoken understanding. Her suspicion became certainty at Henderson's general store. The bell above the door jingled its familiar, tinny tune as she entered. Old Mr. Henderson was behind the counter, polishing the same glass jar of peppermint sticks that had been there since her childhood. He offered a thin, strained smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah picked up a loaf of bread and a can of soup, her movements slow, deliberate. As she placed them on the counter, she met his gaze and held it. "It's a heavy burden, isn't it, Mr. Henderson?" she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Knowing, and never speaking. The old man's hands stilled on the jar. The forced amiability drained from his face, leaving behind a raw weariness. He looked at her not as a customer, but as a fellow prisoner. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting the shadows themselves to be listening. "It's the price of peace, child," he murmured, his words coated in a lifetime of regret. "You think your family's the only one? You look at the Claibornes down by the creek, or the Hargroves up on the ridge. You look at the way their children, the way some of 'em are. You think that's just bad luck?" He shook his head, a slow, sorrowful motion. "We all made our choices a long time ago, to look away, to keep the peace, to protect our own. Speaking the truth, that just breaks everything. It breaks families. It breaks the whole town." He bagged her items with trembling hands, his confession hanging in the dusty air between them. It was not an admission of his own family's involvement, but an acknowledgement of the system, the culture of secrecy that enabled it all. He was admitting that the entire community was complicit, that they had all chosen the fragile piece of a shared lie over the devastating storm of truth. The inbreeding was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a community-wide affliction, a cultural rot they had all agreed to ignore. The shame was not individual. It was collective, a dark stain they all wore beneath their clothes, a uniform of guilt that every resident of Hollow Creek donned each morning. The web of silence was not spun by a single spider, but by every soul in the holler, each adding their own silken thread of denial until the whole town was trapped in its intricate, suffocating design. The arrival of a stranger in Hollow Creek was an event as rare and disruptive as a thunderclap in a dead calm. He came in a dusty sedan that was too new, too generic, an alien vessel from the world beyond the hills. Sarah first saw him from the window of her rented room, his figure crisp and out of place as he stepped out onto the main street, a digital camera slung around his neck and a notebook in his hand. He moved with an outsider's confidence, an unearned familiarity that made the town seem to shrink away from him. The usual porch sitters disappeared inside, curtains twitched in upstairs windows, and the general store's open sign was abruptly flipped to closed. Hollow Creek had sensed a predator, and its instinct was to play dead. His name was Ben, and he found Sarah later that afternoon, cornering her with an easy smile as she left the post office. He introduced himself as a freelance journalist, his voice a smooth, educated baritone that felt abrasive in the soft mountain air. He was researching a piece on isolated Appalachian communities, he said, but his questions were sharp, surgical instruments probing for a specific weakness. He asked about local health trends, about rare genetic disorders, about clusters of certain conditions that might be more prevalent here than in the general population. He mentioned rumors, whispers from nearby towns about Hollow Creek's unique gene pool. His gaze was keen and intelligent, missing nothing, and Sarah felt the ledger's secret stir within her, a beast sensing a kindred hunter. That evening, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, The photocopied pages from the ledger spread around her like a map to a cursed treasure. Ben's card lay beside them, a stark white rectangle promising validation, exposure, and an end to the suffocating silence. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, a physical agony. To share this with him would be to unleash a whirlwind. The truth would be stripped of its context, flattened into a sensational headline about incest and deformity. Her family, Elijah, her broken mother, her conflicted brother, would be transformed into grotesque caricatures for the world to gawk at. Their shame would become a public spectacle, their land and their name forever synonymous with monstrosity. The fragile, broken people she had grown up with would be devoured by the judgment of a world that could never understand the complex prison of isolation and tradition that had forged them. But the alternative was to become another thread in the web of silence, to take her place among the complicit, to allow the cycle to continue for another generation. The weight of the secret was a cancer, and keeping it buried was letting it metastasize. Ben represented a scalpel, brutal and painful, but potentially curative. To give him the evidence was to choose truth over protection, to believe that the devastating cost of exposure was a price that had to be paid for any chance of healing, for any hope of breaking the ancient, twisted chain. She stared at the damning entries, at the proof of her own cursed origin, and felt the two futures warring within her, one of continued, hidden decay, and one of violent, cleansing ruin. The outsider's gaze had found the fault line in Hollow Creek's foundation, and she alone held the power to decide whether to let the whole structure fall. The decision to trust Ben felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to an inevitable current. Sarah met him at the edge of town, where the paved road dissolved into gravel, a symbolic no-man's land between Hollow Creek's insular world and the one he represented. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain and the weight of the manila envelope she clutched in her hands. Inside were the photocopied pages from the ledger, a history of sin translated into stark, undeniable evidence. Ben's expression was sober as he took it, his journalist's eagerness tempered by the grim reality of what the documents contained. He didn't offer platitudes or false reassurance. He simply nodded, a silent pact sealed between them to follow the truth, no matter how dark the path. Their alliance became a quiet, relentless investigation, a peeling back of layers from a wound that had festered for generations. They started with the reluctant, those who lived on the frayed edges of the community's silence. There was Maeve Claiborne, a reclusive woman in a tar paper shack at the foot of the ridge, whose 3 children rarely left the house. When Ben showed her the ledger's pattern and gently asked about her own family, her face crumpled not in denial, but in weary recognition. She didn't speak of love or tradition, only of a grim inevitability, of a choice between marrying a cousin or having no prospects at all. Her confirmation was a quiet, heartbreaking whisper that added another branch to the twisted family tree. Next was old Tom Hargrove, who ran the decrepit gas station on the county line. He was initially hostile, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Ben's notebook. But when Sarah spoke, when she used the old names and the familiar, coded language of the holler, his defensiveness gave way to a grudging, shame-filled candor. He spoke of his own sister, of a marriage that had been arranged to keep a parcel of land in the family, of a son who had been born with a heart condition that the doctor from the next town over had called a familial pattern. Each interview was like striking a match in a cavern, illuminating for a brief, stark moment another corner of the vast, hidden truth. The inbreeding was not a secret. It was an open secret, a foundational flaw in the community's architecture that everyone saw but no one acknowledged. The town's guardians, however, were not idle. The elders, the self-appointed sentinels of Hollow Creek's silence, felt the shift in the air, the subtle unraveling of their carefully maintained order. The first warning came as Sarah walked back to her room one evening. Elijah's truck was parked across the street, the engine off, the man himself a dark silhouette behind the wheel. He didn't get out, didn't speak. He simply watched her, his gaze a physical pressure, a reminder of the fortress walls she was assaulting. It was a threat as potent as any shouted curse, a silent promise of consequences. The second warning was more direct. As Ben was leaving the diner after a solitary lunch, 2 men Sarah recognized as distant cousins, bulky, Hard-faced men who worked the family's timber allotment cornered him in the parking lot. They didn't touch him, but they stood close, crowding his space, their presence an unmistakable message. Their words, low and guttural, were about respect, about family, about how outsiders who stirred up trouble sometimes had accidents on these winding mountain roads. They mentioned Sarah by name, a not-so-subtle hint that her complicity in this betrayal would not be forgiven. The threats were clumsy, born of brute force and desperation, but they were effective. They made the abstract danger real, transforming the town's oppressive silence into an active, malevolent force determined to maintain its grip, no matter the cost. The unraveling had begun, and the threads they were pulling were connected to a web of power that was now fighting back. The article hit with the force of a flash flood, a torrent of ink and pixels that swept through the insulated valley of Hollow Creek and left nothing untouched. Ben's piece, published in a regional newspaper with a robust online presence, was not a gentle exposé but a clinical dissection. It laid out the genealogical evidence with forensic detail, mapping the interlocking branches of the family trees, naming names, and drawing direct lines from the practice of generational inbreeding to the clusters of genetic disorders that state health records had quietly noted for years. It spoke of systemic, culturally enforced incest, and a community-wide conspiracy of silence, the outside world, which had always been a distant, abstract threat, now had a voice, and it was shouting their darkest secret from the digital rooftops. The piece of Hollow Creek, always a fragile illusion woven from silence and shared shame, shattered into a million sharp-edged pieces. The change was immediate and visceral. Walking to the general store the morning the article broke, Sarah felt the weight of the town's gaze solidify from wary avoidance into active, burning hostility. Where once eyes had slid away, they now fixed upon her with naked accusation. A woman she had known since childhood crossed the street to avoid passing her on the sidewalk, her face a mask of pure contempt. From a porch across the way, an old man she'd called Uncle Joe her whole life spat a stream of tobacco into the dust, the gesture of vulgar dismissal. The silence was gone, replaced by a low, simmering hum of outrage, and she was its focal point. The phone at her rented room began to ring that afternoon, a relentless, jarring sound. The voices on the other end were those of aunts, cousins, people who had held her as a baby. They were not calling with concern or questions. They called to accuse, their voices trembling with a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical force. "How could you?" a cousin hissed. "You've shamed us all. You've destroyed this family for good." Another, an elder from a branch of the family she'd barely known, simply said, "You're no daughter of this holler. You're a poison," before the line went dead. Each call was a door slamming shut, severing a connection she had thought, however strained, was eternal. She was no longer Sarah. She was the betrayer, the leak, the one who had dragged their dirty laundry into the blinding light of day for strangers to mock and judge. The final, most crushing blow came from her own brother, Jacob. He didn't call. He came to her door, his face a thundercloud of fury and pain. He stood on the top step, not crossing the threshold, as if her space was now contaminated. "Was it worth it?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Was your need to be the big hero worth destroying everything? Mom won't leave her room. Dad, they're calling for his head. They're talking about taking the land. Everything he built, everything we are, is gone because of you." He was not just her brother. He was her nephew, a product of the very system she had exposed, and in his rage was the terrified confusion of a man whose entire identity had just been publicly dismantled. "We could have just lived with it," he seethed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We were living with it. Now we have nothing. You've made us freaks for the whole world to see." He turned and stormed away, leaving her standing in the doorway, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a tombstone. She looked out at the town. The main street was deserted, but she could feel the eyes watching from behind every curtain, every cracked door. The fragile peace was not just broken. It was pulverized. The shared shame that had once bound them together in silence had now been weaponized, turning neighbor against neighbor, family against family. In exposing the sickness, she had not administered a cure. She had triggered a violent, fevered crisis, and the patient was tearing itself apart. The unraveling was complete, and the fabric of Hollow Creek lay in tatters, with her standing alone in the center of the wreckage. The storm of the town's judgment was a distant rumble compared to the hurricane that arrived on her doorstep in the form of her brother. Jacob did not knock. The door to her rented room burst inward, the flimsy lock splintering under the force of his fury. He filled the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the gray afternoon light. His face a contorted mask of a pain so raw it was almost unrecognizable. This was not the quiet, sullen boy she had grown up with. This was a man whose foundational truths had been dynamited, and the explosion had left only rage in its wake. He advanced into the small room, his presence making the space feel claustrophobic, dangerous. The air crackled with the energy of his unspent violence. He stopped a few feet from her, his chest heaving, his eyes, so like their father's, burning with an accusatory fire. "You had no right," he snarled, the words ripped from somewhere deep and wounded. "No goddamn right to tear it all down," he gestured wildly, a sweeping motion that seemed to encompass the whole town, their family, their entire history. "We had a life. It wasn't perfect, it was what it was. And you, with your city ideas and your selfishness, you just had to come back and set a match to it all." Sarah stood her ground, the ledger's cold truths a shield against his heat. But the shield was cracking under the force of his pain. He was not just her brother. He was her nephew, a living, breathing consequence of the very secret she had exposed. In his furious eyes, she saw the twisted reflection of their shared blood, a bond that was now a weapon. His anger faltered for a moment, collapsing into a more terrifying confusion. He ran a hand through his hair, his voice dropping to a ragged, broken whisper. "I knew, all right? I'm not a fool. I saw the way people looked at us. I heard the whispers. I saw the things in our own family. But you learn not to look too close. You learn to just live with it. Because what's the other choice? This?" He gestured at the space between them, the chasm of betrayal. "This chaos? This shame?" The confession hung in the air, a testament to the power of willful ignorance. He had chosen the gilded cage, had accepted its constraints in exchange for the illusion of peace. Her quest for truth was, in his eyes, the ultimate act of destruction, a selfish rebellion that had cost them all their home. His internal conflict boiled over, the anger surging back, hotter and more focused. He took a sudden, lurching step forward, his hand snapping out to grip her arm. His fingers were like iron bands, bruising in their intensity. "You ruined us," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath hot against her skin. "You've made us a joke, a headline. For what? So you could feel better about yourself." The physical tension snapped the last thread of civility. Sarah tried to pull back, but his grip tightened, his other hand coming up, not to strike, but to hover, a clenched fist trembling with the effort of restraint. For a heart-stopping second, the specter of violence was a third person in the room, its presence as palpable as the dust motes dancing in the strained light. They were frozen there, a brutal tableau of a family tearing itself apart at the seams. The complex love between sibling and nephew warped into this raw, physical threat. The shared blood that should have been a bond had become the source of a poison that was now coursing through both their veins. And in that charged, silent struggle, the true, horrifying cost of Hollow Creek's secret was finally laid bare. The mountains had always been the first and last lesson for any boy growing up in Hollow Creek. They were not a backdrop but a boundary, a great, silent wall of rock and ancient trees that taught a child his place in the world before he could even walk. For Elijah Miller, learning that lesson had been as natural as breathing, and the teacher had been his own father, Silas. The memory rose not as a gentle recollection, but as a stark, unbidden specter, summoned by the wreckage his daughter had wrought. It was the summer of his 16th year, the air thick with humidity and the scent of cut hay, when his education in the family's particular brand of preservation had reached its culmination. Silas had taken him to the high pasture, the one that looked out over the whole of their land, the rolling fields, the dense, untamed woods, the creek that carved a silver thread through the heart of it all. They stood side by side, not as father and son, but as one steward and his heir. Silas, a man carved from the same granite as the hills, pointed a calloused finger across the valley. You see that, boy? That's more than dirt and trees. That's 100 years of millers. Our blood is in that soil. Our bones are in these hills. Letting an outsider in, it's like pouring muddy water into a clean spring. It ruins everything. The lesson was not new. The isolation of Hollow Creek was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate fortress, its walls built from generations of fear. The stories were part of the local lore, told not as campfire tales but as sober history, of great-grandfathers cheated by smooth-talking land speculators from the flatlands, of uncles who had married outside the holler only to have their wives leave, taking children and property with them, of the slow, insidious erosion of their way of life that began the moment a stranger's blood was introduced. The outside world was a predator, and the only way to survive was to keep the gate locked and the bloodlines pure. A few weeks later, the practical application of this doctrine was presented to him. It was a Sunday dinner, the table laden with food, the air stifling. Sitting across from him was his cousin, Mary. She was a quiet girl with their family's same dark eyes and a timid smile. Elijah had grown up with her, had skipped stones with her at the creek, had thought of her as a sister. But that evening, his father's heavy hand clapped him on the shoulder, and the man's voice, low and firm, left no room for misunderstanding. You and Mary will be married next spring. It's what's best. Keeps the land whole. It keeps the blood strong. There had been no discussion of love, of attraction, of a shared future. There was only the grim, unassailable logic of the fortress. Mary had looked down at her plate, her cheeks flushed with a shame that Elijah was only just beginning to comprehend. He remembered the cold knot that had tightened in his stomach, a primal rebellion that was quickly smothered by a lifetime of conditioning. To refuse was not to defy his father. It was to betray his blood, his name, his very identity. It was to choose the dangerous, unknown world over the security of the known, even if the known was a gilded cage. The pressure was not a request. It was a law of nature, as immutable as the turning of the seasons. He had nodded, his own eyes dropping to his plate, the first brick of his own complicity laid firmly in place. He had been raised inside the cycle, groomed to become its next guardian, and in that moment, he accepted his destiny, ensuring the twisted roots would dig deeper, waiting for the next generation to be born into its shadow. The silence that fell over Hollow Creek in the wake of the article's publication was not the old, watchful silence of shared secrets. It was the hollow, ringing silence that follows a detonation, a vacuum where sound itself has been blasted away. For Sarah's mother, Lillian, that silence became a prison from which there was only one escape. The weight of a lifetime of shame, a burden she had carried since she understood the nature of her own birth, had been made public, dissected, and judged by a world that could never comprehend the gilded cage of her existence. The fragile shell of denial she had maintained for decades, the one that had allowed her to be both a daughter and a wife, finally shattered under the glare of outsider scrutiny. She was found in the small, airless bedroom where she had slept alone for years, the room that still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets her own mother had made. She had chosen the most private of exits, a handful of Elijah's old prescription pills washed down with the cheap whiskey he kept in the barn. There was no drama, no violent struggle, only a profound and final surrender. On the nightstand beside the empty bottle and the scattered pills lay a single sheet of lined paper, her handwriting a shaky, spidery script that spoke of a hand trembling with more than just age. The note was not long. It did not speak of love for her children or fond memories. It was a raw, unadorned accusation aimed at the heart of the town itself. The secrets of this holler are a poison, it began. We drank it and called it water. We breathed it and called it air. We told ourselves it was tradition, but it was just a slow death. I can't carry the shame anymore. I can't be his daughter and his wife and my children's grandmother. The silence is what killed me. The silence of every one of you who knew and never spoke. You are all guilty. You let this happen. You let us live this lie, asterisk. It was signed with nothing but her name, a final, stark claim to an identity that had always been a contradiction. The news of her suicide rippled through the community not as a tragedy, but as a reckoning. The collective outrage that had been directed at Sarah curdled into something colder, more introspective. The woman's death was a mirror held up to the entire town, and the reflection was too grotesque to bear. The consequences of their actions were no longer abstract concepts, genetic disorders, social stigma. They were now a corpse in a quiet house, a mother driven to self-annihilation by the weight of a secret they had all agreed to keep. Neighbors who had shunned Sarah now avoided each other's eyes, the shared guilt anew, more oppressive silence that settled over the valley. The fortress of secrecy had not protected them. It had become their tomb. For Sarah, the guilt was a physical presence, a cold, heavy stone lodged in her chest where her heart used to be. Standing at her mother's graveside, a mere few weeks after her grandmother's funeral, she felt the world tilt on a new, more desolate axis. The fresh mound of earth was an accusation. Her quest for truth, her belief in the cleansing power of exposure, had not set anyone free. It had pushed the most broken of them all over the edge. She had wanted to break the cycle, but she had only succeeded in breaking her mother. Every word of the article, every piece of evidence she had handed to Ben, felt like a shove she had given, leading Lillian to this final, desperate act. The truth had not been a cure. It had been a weapon, and she had wielded it with the devastating precision of an outsider, unaware of the fragile human cost. She had come to Hollow Creek to unearth secrets, and in doing so, she had buried her mother, the first and most tragic casualty of a war she had declared on the past. The state vehicles arrived not with sirens, but with the low, official hum of engines that spoke of cold procedure and unimpeachable authority. They were a fleet of gray sedans and unmarked vans, their government plates glaringly alien against the backdrop of peeling pickup trucks and rusted mailboxes. Their arrival was the final, undeniable proof that Hollow Creek's walls had been breached, that the outside world was no longer a distant rumor but a present, invasive force. The agents who stepped out wore expressions of detached professionalism, their eyes cataloging the decay and the wariness with the same clinical efficiency. They carried clipboards and evidence bags, their purpose as clean and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, ready to dissect the festering wound the town had hidden for generations. The investigation was a slow, meticulous unraveling of the community's soul. Agents conducted interviews in living rooms that had never known a stranger's presence, their questions polite, precise, and utterly devastating. They took DNA swabs from reluctant mouths, their cotton tips collecting not just saliva, but a century of hidden shame. They pored over land deeds and birth certificates, cross-referencing them with the damning ledger and Ben's article, building an irrefutable case not of individual crimes, but of a cultural sickness. The arrests began quietly at first. Elijah was taken from his porch at dawn, his hands cuffed with a metallic click that echoed through the holler like a death knell. Then others followed. Uncles, cousins, men who had been pillars of a rotten structure, now led away in silence, their heads bowed not in guilt, but in a stunned, furious humiliation. The media scrutiny was a second, more public trial. Satellite trucks sprouted at the edge of town like metallic fungi, their dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting the town's disgrace to a fascinated, horrified world. Reporters with two bright smiles and microphones stood in front of the general store, reducing a complex tragedy of isolation and fear into a 2-minute segment about incestuous hillbillies and backwoods horrors. The label freaks was no longer a whispered fear. It was a headline, a hashtag, a brand seared onto every person who called Hollow Creek home. The town's isolation, once its shield, was now its cage, and the whole world was gathered outside the bars, pointing and staring. Inside the cage, the community turned on itself with a ferocity born of trapped desperation. The web of silence, once a bond of shared complicity, became a net in which they were all entangled, thrashing to save themselves. In the queue at the post office, lifelong neighbors accused each other of talking to the agents, their voices sharp with betrayal. Some, broken by the weight of it all, offered tearful public confessions to anyone who would listen, desperate to absolve themselves by sharing the burden. Others, their faces set in masks of stubborn denial, stood on their porches and shouted at the news vans, proclaiming their innocence and cursing the outsiders who had destroyed their lives. The trust that had held the fragile community together evaporated, replaced by a pervasive paranoia. Every conversation was suspect, every glance a potential accusation. The judgment from outside had been brutal, but the judgment they inflicted upon each other in the ruins of their shared secret was a far more intimate and devastating punishment, ensuring that even if the state investigators eventually left, the scars of their visit would never fade. The fall of a king in a small kingdom is a quiet, brutal affair. There were no trumpets, no proclamations, only the slow, inexorable erosion of a man's entire world. For Elijah Miller, the collapse began with the state's seizure of the land, the high pastures, the timber allotments, the creekside fields that had been in the Miller name for 5 generations. The official notices, crisp and impersonal, were tacked to his porch posts, their legal language a foreign invasion that stripped him of more than dirt and trees. It severed the roots that connected him to his ancestors, to his own identity. The land was not just property. It was the physical manifestation of the pure blood he had fought so desperately to preserve, and now it was gone. His status crumbled next. The few men who had still looked to him for guidance, out of habit or fear, now crossed the street to avoid him. He was no longer the patriarch, the guardian of the old ways. He was a pariah, a living reminder of the shame that had been dragged into the light. The general store refused him credit. His usual chair at the diner remained conspicuously empty, the waitress suddenly too busy to take his order. He became a ghost in his own town, a specter haunting the ruins of the life he had built on a foundation of lies and twisted tradition. The fortress walls he had spent a lifetime maintaining had not just been breached. They had been dismantled, stone by stone, until he stood exposed and utterly alone. In the perpetual twilight of his now silent house, surrounded by the ghosts of his choices, a moment of piercing clarity found him. It was late, the moon a cold sliver in the sky, and he sat in his worn armchair, the ashes in the fireplace long since gone cold. The grand edifice of his beliefs, the entire justification for a lifetime of monstrous acts, suddenly seemed like a child's sandcastle, fragile and absurd. He saw, with a stunning and terrible lucidity, the damage he had caused, the broken life of his daughter-wife, the suicide that stained his conscience, the generational trauma he had inflicted upon his children and grandchildren. The pure blood was a poison, and he had been its chief architect, administering the dose to each new generation with the solemnity of a high priest. A low, guttural sound escaped him, a groan of pure, unadulterated despair that was the first honest noise he had made in decades. Yet, even in the wreckage, the old beliefs clung to him like lichen to a dead tree. The conviction that he had been protecting something sacred, that the outside world was the true enemy, was too deeply ingrained to be fully excised. It was a reflex, a survival mechanism for a soul that could not bear the full weight of its own guilt. He had fallen, but a part of him still believed the ground he had been standing on was holy. It was into this scene of profound ruin that Sarah came. She found him not in his chair, but on the floor, slumped against the cold hearth, his face streaked with grime and dried tears. The formidable man who had once dominated every room was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell, his eyes vacant and lost. The air in the room was thick with the smell of dust and despair. He did not look up as she entered, but his shoulders gave a slight, weary tremor, the only acknowledgement of her presence. She stood over him, not with anger or triumph, but with a devastating pity. This broken thing, this relic of a monstrous faith, was her father, her grandfather, the source of her own cursed blood. He was no longer a tyrant to be feared, but a tragedy to be mourned, the living, breathing embodiment of the catastrophic failure of their bloodline, a man who had sacrificed everything, including his own humanity, for a lie he could not stop believing. The road out of Hollow Creek unspooled before her, a gray ribbon leading away from the Valley of Shadows, each rotation of the tires a measured beat in the rhythm of a final, irrevocable farewell. Sarah did not look back in the rearview mirror. There was no need. The image of the town was seared into her memory. The slumped shoulders of the houses, the bruised sky pressing down on the hills, the collective weight of a century of silence that no single act of truth could ever fully lift. She was leaving, but she carried the hollowed-out heart of the place with her, a locket of grief and revelation that would hang heavy around her neck for the rest of her life. Her reflection was not of victory, but of cost. The truth had been a scalpel, and she had wielded it with the desperate hope of cutting out a cancer. But surgery is a violent, bloody business, and the patient does not always survive the cure. Her mother's grave was the starkest price, a raw wound in the earth that represented the ultimate failure of their insular world. The truth had not set Lillian free. It had been the final unbearable weight that broke her. The town, too, was not healed. It was merely changed, its silent complicity replaced by a louder, more fractious shame. Its people scattered and suspicious, picking through the rubble of their shared identity. The cycle of secrecy was broken, but what remained was the scorched earth of its passing, a landscape littered with the wreckage of lives built on a foundation of lies. Yet, as the car climbed the final ridge and the cell service flickered tentatively back to life, a different kind of echo reached her. It was a text from a woman she had barely known, a young mother from a neighboring holler who had read Ben's article. The message was simple, a few halting words of thanks, an admission that the exposure, for all its pain, had given her the courage to ask her own family difficult questions, to break a similar, smaller pattern before it could claim another generation. It was a single, fragile thread of hope, a sign that the poison, once named, could begin to lose its power. The town in the rearview mirror remained shrouded, a place changed but not redeemed. Yet, within its fractured heart, a subtle, nascent shift was taking root. A few residents, mostly from the younger generations who had always sensed the wrongness in the air but lacked the words for it, were beginning to speak in hushed, determined tones. They advocated not for a return to the old silence, but for a painful, awkward openness, for genetic counseling, for reaching out beyond the encircling hills. They were the first green shoots pushing through the ashes, a testament to the enduring human instinct for light, even after a long confinement in the dark. Sarah drove on, away from the shadows of Hollow Creek, her own vow a quiet mantra in her mind. She would carry the scars, she would honor the cost, and she would live a life so open, so free from the ghosts of that twisted legacy, that the cycle could find no purchase in her or in any who came after. The beginning was an ending, and the road ahead was long, but for the first time it led toward the light.